Welcome to Reroll Multiple Martial Arts Podcast, where we explore the intersections between martial arts, society, and culture. I'm Elliot,
Danny,
and this is our second podcast. How are you doing, Danny?
good. Just trying to kind of keep up with the quarantine, stay somewhat centered. Kind of getting harder and harder.
So, we're doing this show, trying out different things. How are you feeling?
Good. I think this will be a good opportunity to maybe just stay engaged. This being our second podcast, one of the things that I think helps maybe is to not necessarily recap everything we talked about in the last one, but maybe just give some thoughts on the podcast that we set out as a pilot. I got a chance to hear it, which is always kind of weird, when you hear yourself. But I was trying my best to think about um, not being invested that it was myself speaking. And one of the things that I thought about was just that awkwardness of feeling that you don't say things always correctly. So, like, I was listening to a statement that I made about Aikido, and I said Aikido is all offense, and that's inaccurate. Aikido is not all offense. Aikido is a defensive martial art. So I was like, wow, you just totally said inaccurate. You said an inaccurate statement. But I thought about later, like, hey, that's just life. Sometimes we're speaking and things don't come out as perfect as we wish they were.
So, today we wanted to talk about the different styles. And, Danny, you're unique in that you've trained in a lot of different martial arts. And, you can see I want to ask you what you learned from them or maybe not learned from them. Um, and you started off with Kenjusturyu Okinawan style karate. Is that right?
Yeah, that was my first martial art class, I guess formal. One of the things that's weird is not weird, but like when we ask ourselves, like, what was your first martial art class? Many of us will say, um, it was my big brother or my dad or my cousin or my neighbor taught us. So there were some martial art classes, I guess more organically or informal before that. But I remember being in 13 and going to this class that was upstairs at the at the Salvation Army Recreation Center in downtown LA. And I didn't know much. To me, it was just karate, and it was a style, an Okinawan based martial art, Kenjuturu. Again, I didn't know of the families, but in the karate family, there's a bunch of stuff. Then there's like Taekwondo, which another style. So there's different. They're not all the same. Even though in the United States for a long time we called everything karate. We even called judo karate. There was like karate schools, and you went in, and it was a judo school. Or we did vice versa. We called everything judo. It was a judo chop. So I think that's why it's kind of messy, but to the point. Yeah, Kenjuturu. It's an Okinawan traditional style that I started with, and I stayed there probably about, I don't know, I want to say 2 to 3 years. I remember I stopped when I entered high school.
Hmm. Why did you stop?
When I entered high school, my routine changed. Like, I was bused into my high school into the valley. So coming back into LA after being on the bus all day and then homework, it was kind of really interesting because it was an abrupt stop. Just imagine, like, you start school on Monday, and um, the karate classes were Tuesday, Thursdays at 6, and I just didn't go that Tuesday. So it stopped, and before I knew it, I wasn't doing anything, and I didn't pick up martial arts again till I started college, which was a couple years. I would say probably like 4 years later, maybe 4 to 5 years later.
Why did you start training in Taekwondo?
Well, by that time I was in college, and I think most college students find themselves at their student rec center, looking at the list of things, and one of the things that I saw was Taekwondo, and also my roommate had a friend who was a black belt in Taekwondo. I would say like Olympic level Taekwondo martial artist, and that was that's probably the most accurate of why I ended up in Taekwondo. That conversation of like having a buddy who has a buddy who's talking about Taekwondo, and not just talking, but he was a top level competitor, national. When I say Olympic levels, because that's how he talked about it. He's like, he was trying to compete to be in the Olympics. So that was a level of martial artist that I had never met before. And so I took a couple classes. I did about a year there. Um, and that took me, I was always roving. And I ended up actually surprisingly in college, returning back to what I recognized as Okinawan, because I remember being in that same Taekwondo class at the rec center. And the rec center over there was a long basketball court section that was set quadrant off for different activities. And in one end was the Taekwondo class. And I looked over to the other side and I recognized the white pajamas. Taekwondo wore the same similar gis too, but I recognized these uniquely, and I recognized their moves. They were doing a kata that by that time I had forgotten the name, but it was a Heian Shodan. And I was like, oh, I remember that. It literally, my memory of a 13, 15-year-old kid remembered those moves, and I went over, and it was Shotokan. And Shotokan is very similar. It's part of that family of Okinawan martial arts. And I started training with them too. So that was my return back to Shotokan or Okinawan.
So did you train Taekwondo and Shotokan at the same time, or you stopped doing Taekwondo?
I overlapped it. Like I kept Taekwondo for a minute, and then I realized that I just wanted to go back to something I recognized. Taekwondo was really interesting. It was a level of athleticism that was higher than the Kenjusturyu and Shotokan style. One is they emphasized kicks, and to be more specific, the Taekwondo that I got to see, and I think most of us have gotten to see, is the one that is Olympic compatible Taekwondo. So when you spar, you see a lot of people drop their hands to their sides, which is horrible for actual fighting. But it's what you do if you're trying to compete in the Olympics.
So, when you're doing that, was Taekwondo and karate, was that kind of complementary to each other? Did you find it conflicting, like certain stances or moves?
Yeah, I like I said, I really found it frustrating that not everything transferred over. So in that time space, I found myself like, remembering what I had done between the ages of, let's say, 13 and 15 or 13 and 16. And then thinking about that I knew what a roundhouse was. I knew what a front snap was. I knew what a front thrust kick was, but they had different names. Um, they also, in Taekwondo, they do forms. They don't call them katas, but they do forms, and I forget what they call them. But their styles were different, so that I was stubborn. Now I realize that I really appreciated. I guess I did. I was stuck on the foundation that I had built when I was 13, so that I wanted these very rigid, locked in positions that they're not as soft when you do them in forms. You kind of hear your uniform snap because your whole body just like pops and stops. And in Taekwondo, my sensei wasn't telling me to do it that way. So I felt it was weak, but it really wasn't. It was just a different rhythm. So I think that's what happened with me in Taekwondo. Like, uh, in fact, I returned to it later on, but that was just my first introduction. And every time I realized that it was a different rhythm, a different movement. And then the emphasis again on the kicks. Taekwondo has amazing kicks, a level of coordination that I would put comparable to like gymnastics. Seeing people jump and do 3 different types of kicks in the air. We never did anything like that in Kenjutsu or in Shotokan.
So, So while you're doing Shotokan, how did you get introduced to Aikido?
The same way. So Aikido, um, again in that rec center, I'm describing it as this very long basketball court with like three sections. That's where all the martial arts were at. So that when you were doing Taekwondo, you would look over and someone's doing Aikido, and you would look to the other side, maybe they're doing Judo. So I was like, I always liked Aikido. I thought it was a beautiful art. It sounds actually even silly, but I liked their uniforms. The skirt, I think it's called a kama. I may be wrong on that. I just thought um, it was stereotypical what a young impressionable movie person kid would follow, like this flowingness. They fly. You know, like when someone grabs your wrist in Aikido, there's this move and the person just flies. So I was that person that was like, I want to learn that. I started training with that a little bit. Um, I also returned to it later on in UC Riverside. We had, and we still do have a really good Aikido program at UC Riverside. And I trained with them for a couple, I'd say like almost 2 years, I ended up actually doing more of their traditional weapons emphasis, the Boken, the Joe. Um, and by that time, I skipped a section because when I graduated from my college period, I came back to LA, and I had stayed training in Shotokan up north. So I down here in LA, I found a Shotokan school and run by students. But the beautiful part about this statement is that these are students that were in their 60s, because this Shotokan school was was running for like 40 years. And these students just aged into senseis, but they still called themselves student. It was a student-run Shotokan school. But my senseis were all in their 60s, 70s, amazing instructors. And when I got accepted to Riverside, I also trained here in Shotokan. Ray Dalkey had built a really great program here in UCR, and Sensei Otis, Sensei Warner. These people had built an amazing, and they still run a really strong Shotokan program here. So I stuck with it. But and UCR, the same thing. You could do all of them. So I found myself into Shotokan, Judo, Aikido.
So so you really like Shotokan.
Yeah, it stuck. I ended up doing it so much. I eventually reached the level of Shodan, which is their first level black belt. And it was one of those things that I just stuck. I was stubborn. Like I just stayed with it all through grad school, and eventually you test, and then they go, there isn't any more other than black belt. You should be testing for black belt. And I'll be honest, I didn't want to do that. I didn't think it was something I wanted. I didn't understand it. Like to me, my sense of titles has always been a problem. And in martial arts, I was translating that in there. Like I don't need belts, I don't need titles. But I did. Eventually, I tested, and I achieved the level of Shodan, which is just level one black belt. Which is interesting because in Shotokan, it's different to be a black belt than like in Jiu Jitsu to be a black belt.
Did you compete in Shotokan?
No, I didn't. I competed when I was a kid, a young man, when I was 13, and that was funny because it was so awkward. But as an adult, um, I didn't understand competition. The competition that I understood was it's not tag, but it's a point sparring section. I'm not supposed to punch you so hard in the face that your teeth pop out. That disqualifies you. But I'm supposed to punch you and stop centimeters away from your lip. And then the ref goes, that's a full point. I couldn't get into that. I know I must sound like a horrible human being, but I just didn't know how to do that. Like, how do you spar like that?
Wow, that's a lot of control. That's some like true martial artist stuff, like some movie stuff. So 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 you've also did judo. Well, what about traditional weapons? How does that fall into this whole like, story?
Well, Aikido as a martial art, it's a beautiful martial art. And it is rooted in some real difficult, I guess, like combat history. So when people think about Aikido, I think most of people think about it as like the pacifists martial art, the martial art of peace, because they're in Aikido, you're not attacking anyone, you're defending yourself from an attack. And within Aikido, they have the flowing redirection, but they also have traditional weapons. So you'll learn the Jo, which is like the stick, the long staff in Chinese martial arts, maybe they might call it that. They have the Boken, which is the wooden sword, which is a training tool for the actual sword. Some people will eventually in Aikido train with an actual sword, maybe not sharpened, but it's metal. And at UCR, they had a class specifically for traditional weapons, and you could sign up for it, and it was still Aikido, but instead of doing the break falls and the wrist locks, you were learning the weapons.
Mm. So, so after that, you started doing judo.
Yeah, I was doing Shotokan, and judo was next door, and I just walked over one summer, um, and Sensei Hiroka, he recently passed away, um, was teaching, and he was such a nice dude. He's just like, come on in to take a class, and I did, and I thought it was amazing, and I already knew judo, or I already knew that I appreciated judo. In a lot of the martial arts circles, there's a lot of respect for judokas. There's just a lot of appreciation for the art. As you train in more of the Japanese Budo um, area of martial arts, there's this pantheon, I guess, or collection of styles, and judo was always one of the ones that was highly respected. And I don't know if it has to do with the fact that we got to see it early on in the Olympics, or that we got to see it in comic books and in movies where people would fly over, where you would just like throw people. And their training was I don't know, high level difficult. Like the hardest I've ever seen, where you would pick up your classmate and be told to run around the gym with someone on your back. That type of training I hadn't seen since I was like, again, 13. Mr. Rios came from an Okinawan style of hard training. And I never even saw a lot of that since that point. So when I went to judo at UCR, I recognized their training. I was like, oh, they're training just like I had seen it 20 plus years earlier.
Wow. It's great that so many of these things kind of go full circle. You're trying different styles, but it all kind of comes together somehow.
I wonder if it comes together because of the way that you are ultimately doing something that is philosophically rooted in a common point, that like martial arts, by the very nature of the term we're using, it's a combat art, an art that is rooted in, for lack of a better word, fighting. But it's not right. I don't feel right calling it's rooted in fighting. It's an art that may be rooted in military fighting, self-defense fighting, but it is an art that is rooted in the body exerting energy. I'll use the word violence, whether it's to defend yourself or not. And maybe that's an anchor. I'm not sure. I would, in fact, I would like to hear your thoughts on that. Like, what are your thoughts on these different martial arts? Like, when you think about these martial arts, do you feel that they're rooted in a sameness?
I think it's really interesting because I'm thinking of like how how martial arts kind of branched off into different styles. I mean, I don't really know the whole story behind it, but I mean, I think it's great. I mean that, for example, in the say in the Thai region, Laos region, that style, kind of you can see the similarities in that style, Muay Thai and like the Myanmar style, and and so and hearing you talk about karate and the different Japanese styles, I really like. I that's always been interesting. Judo. I've always been into judo. I think one day I would like to train in judo, and oh, there's. I mean, I hate to bring it to reference Bruce Lee again, but I mean it's learning all the different kinds as much as we can, and integrating the stuff that works for us, and disregarding the stuff that doesn't. And I think that's like kind of beautiful. I think um, I think it's kind of like that idea that we have to learn all the basics in order to break the rules. We have to learn all the rules in order to break them. And you know, I kind of lean toward that. I kind of don't like it, but I like that saying.
Also, it's also important to think about just how lucky we are to be in a time where these different martial arts can coexist. But even before coexistence, just their availability. So that I mentioned Kenjusturyu, I didn't look it up. I remember my buddy, um, his name is Edgar, tall dude. Those kids that are 13 and look 25.
Mm.
That was him. He's the one who told me, "Hey, I'm taking karate. You should come to my class." Um, and I remember um, he was the cliche kid that you could use it. I would see him fight, and he was using it. And then I think about these moments where, like, I didn't research Kenjutsu. That's what was available because of that direct contact. If he had been doing Taekwondo, I probably would be telling the story about Taekwondo in 13. But I still feel very fortunate because that was accessible at a bike ride, and my dad would take me after work, to class. But then I keep telling you about these others that started coming around. They were accessible because literally in the moment I was in, they were just walking distance. And I think for a lot of us today, we have that availability. Maybe not universally. I find people that tell me, I wish I could train Muay Thai, but I don't have a gym in my town, or Jiu Jitsu, and I don't have a gym in my town. But it's surprisingly available, and I think that's what I find interesting. That like we are in a moment in time where these different martial arts are able to kind of have a dialogue with one another as we jump in from one room to the other.
And I think it's great that there is this huge dialogue because, back in the day, let's just say 50 years ago, it wasn't like this. A lot of these martial arts schools kept their styles secret. I remember a lot of kung fu schools, these kung fu families, they were really tight knit and didn't want their so-called secrets to, be spread out and stuff like that. And, so, people like, I saw this documentary. It's called the real Miyagi, the real Miyagi. So the martial arts master Fumio Demura, a karate guy, he was one of the first people to bring karate into the United States. And so Sensei Demura and people like Bruce Lee, they got a lot of like criticism from traditionalists in Asia saying, why are you teaching other people this art? And so I think it's great that we're able to experience the fruitfulness of like this whole like you know this current day of so many styles.
The change in approaches, I think, is significant, as you mentioned. the idea of being fortunate to be in a time when you can kind of benefit from different styles because they have become open. It is significant because I don't think that's how they started. The families that kept certain martial arts, I think just the families that kept martial arts in their home were taught as a family recipe, almost the way you would think about a language or a craft or a recipe. But we don't have that. We have a commerce, so that like I know that I can enter and I can be told that I am not welcomed in their dojo. I've seen that happen. People that are just not good people or just incompatible in their energy and their intent are told by their sensei, maybe you should go somewhere else, not here. But for the most part, if you pay your fees, the sensei will teach you. That's not the beginning. That's not how martial arts began. So I think that's where we are right now. We're in a period of transformation that I don't know. I think the philosophies are still there, but there's also this idea that like with our commerce, we've benefited by making them more available, more open, so that I do an inventory of 8 styles. I don't feel that I mastered 8 styles. I just was introduced to 8 styles and maybe did one long enough to get a black belt. But that's all I can say about that. But I feel fortunate because I can't express enough. I really appreciated them. I felt so lucky to know that like my memories of having Sensei Bash teach me how to use the bokken. I still try sometimes and practice it because I had someone dedicate time to correct me and give me a couple skill sets, you know?
No, I mean, there was a time I was training Muay Thai, and I did Filipino martial arts just for like 2 months, and I couldn't fit it into my schedule. It was just too much. Like I couldn't dedicate my life. Um, I couldn't dedicate every ounce of my free time to martial arts. I just couldn't. And so, because I wanted to learn, weapons training. I wanted to learn, the people who taught Bruce Lee, weapons. And so, um, and there's so much history, behind each martial arts, and I think it's great just to learn, just to expand our knowledges and experiences. But I really respect that you do so many, and you could like really like fit your time and just like puzzle it all together. I think that's brilliant. And like I know there's the last bit, but I mean, currently you're doing Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and Muay Thai.
Yeah, I felt well. I was really looking for something that was different. The jujitsu I started, I don't know, probably like 9 years ago, and again, it's frustrating to see your progression be so slow. So that you mentioned this idea of time, that is probably the most frustrating of realities, that we live in a place where time is it's a commodity. Whether you have the economics to say that each class costs you 8 hours of labor to pay one class for an hour, that means you're never going to have enough, because every 8 hours of labor, so you can pay 1 hour of instruction in karate or whatever martial art you want, puts you at a formula that's just unattainable. But what I feel is that even then, anything you do dedicate to it is aggregate. It's a benefit. So I think jiu-jitsu, I've really appreciated. It's been the hardest because a lot of the things that I felt I knew or that I could use as carryover didn't work. So that when I moved from Kenjusturyu to Taekwondo, the roundhouse was somewhat the same. When I went from Taekwondo back to Shotokan, the reverse roundhouse or the snap kick kind of worked out. Even Muay Thai, my teacher corrects me on my stance, too narrow, too high, but a kick's a kick and a punch's a punch. But in jiu-jitsu, there were no kicks and no punches. So it was a not starting from scratch, but it felt like clean slate.
But you did train in judo though, so were there overlaps in that?
Yes, judo has newaza, which is their ground fighting, and in fact, judo. The reason why I said earlier of how much appreciation many of us have toward it is that judo, the jujitsu, the modern jujitsu has its history in judo, and there are little battles between those fields. I can hear them sometimes, but um, the chokes, the arm bars in jiu-jitsu, judo had them, and they had them like 100 years ago.
Cool. Well, I mean, we're like about out of time, but I would like to, talk about, I feel like we kind of skimmed the surface of what you did. Maybe next time, we can go a little bit deeper about which styles you like and what, aspect of each one that you, like to keep, your own multiple martial arts collection. Danny's multiple martial arts collection.
That's funny. Well, I'm actually more curious in thinking about um, where where you kind of think about the material or the idea of practice, uh, the inventory. Like, how do you see these different martial arts? Like, what is your curiosity spin toward them? What is it that you kind of feel that each one would be part of a skill set? Like, if you were putting a toolbox and you had the time, what would you take from each? Maybe that's what we can kind of pick up the conversation again right there, because I'm curious to see how you perceive the different martial arts and the respective directions and skill sets.
That sounds good. Well, this has been Reroll, Multiple Martial Arts Podcast. Until next time, drink water and be water. Remember to drink water and be water.
Stay hydrated.